Hey everyone. I am this semester for myself, just for fun, having some of my friends, having some of my math friends sit through some seminars that I'm giving, in which I wanted to run through and look through and talk about kind of the various attempts by different people to mathematically model the argument that Marx is making, the economic argument he's making in the three volumes of Capital. Um, the problem with this is that they're not political people for the most part. These people that I'm having sit, for the most part, are math nerds, and they're not Marxists. And so what I felt like I had to do was spend the first couple of talks getting them acclimated and introduced to Marxism. And so what I did was I basically made a big PowerPoint, which is what you see on the screen right now, the first slide of, which sort of runs through in a very kind of condensed sort. It kind of runs through the overall kind of argument that Marx is making in a non-mathematical way, in kind of a more informal way. Um, and it's not entirely that either. I mean, it's really supposed to be just a way to get people kind of thinking in the way that I wanted them thinking for the rest of the talks. I wanted people thinking as Marxists. I wanted them to think as materialists, be thinking about, like, have an idea of where we're going with the labor theory of value, have an idea about why we value the labor theory of value, and so forth. I just kind of wanted to make these, and I thought it turned out okay. And so I think it could be valuable as an educational tool for other people, and so I decided I was going to turn these talks into some videos. Now, I am very reserved. I have a lot of reservations about doing this. Because when I give a talk, I don't have to care that much about getting little things wrong, or citing, not properly citing people's work, and things like that. So I want to make it very clear from the get-go that this is strictly just kind of like to get you in your head an idea of what these ideas are. It's not something I'm going to monetize. It's not something that I consider like any kind of like authoritative work. And again, I lift a lot of ideas from both my own brain and other people's things that I've read in the past, without making much of a distinction between them. So I just want people to take that as it is. A lot of people have influenced me, and since then their politics and ideas have diverged from mine, but I nonetheless cite them. Like in the first slide here, I'm going to be citing Richard Dawkins, who's obviously a very problematic figure in a lot of ways, but I still think that he made a nice quote that I could use to kind of make a through line to make a point. So there's a lot of stuff like that in this. But nonetheless, I think it could be I could think it serves well as a decent educational tool, especially if you're somebody that has always been interested in what's contained in those big tomes of Marx's that are Capital Volumes 1 through 3, but have never really been able to break into them. This is for you. If you're that person, this is for you. So let's get started. So to get started, I'm going to start out by kind of framing our discussion of economics, because you have to come into, I think you have to approach economics from a certain perspective in order to really see what Marx wants us to see. Now, Marx and Engels are on record as being heavily inspired by Darwin and his theory of natural selection. Pretty much everyone was in his time. And of course, that theory has been bastardized and used in all sorts of ways, good and bad, since Darwin. But everybody was influenced by Darwin, including Marx and Engels. And so that's why I'm going to open up with this Richard Dawkins quote. Because I think that Richard Dawkins, what he's doing here in his attempt in the beginning of The Selfish Gene to generalize Darwin's survival of the fittest, is to kind of get at a generalization, which is exactly what Marx and Engels grab onto for their inspiration for what they call historical materialism. And it has to do with stability. So let's read a bit of this quote. I don't think I'm going to read the whole thing. Darwin's survival of the fittest is really a special case of a more general law called survival of the stable. The universe is populated by stable things. A stable thing is a collection of atoms that is permanent enough or common enough to deserve a name. It may be a unique collection of atoms, such as the Matterhorn, that lasts long enough to be worth naming, or it may be a class of entities, such as raindrops, that come into existence at a sufficiently high rate to deserve a collective name, even if any one of them is short-lived. The things we see around us and which we think of as needing explanation, rocks, galaxies, ocean waves, etc., are all to a greater or lesser extent stable patterns of atoms. And I want to stop there. So what he's noting is that the things that we see around us are stable. And the reason for that it can be framed sort of teleologically. We can kind of basically say systems in general, whatever system we're talking about, tend to seek stability. That's so important that I'm going to repeat it. Systems tend to seek stability, whatever they are. And you can talk about them as a goal-oriented thing. You can say that systems are like things with agency that are seeking stability. Or you can frame it in maybe a more utilitarian way and say, look, the only things we see around us are going to be things that did that, because otherwise they wouldn't be here anymore. So systems seek stability in sort of almost a vacuous sense. If they don't, then they go away. So the ones we see tend to be the ones that did that. And so a lot of different things are systems seeking stability. One of the things that is a system seeking stability is the thing that Darwin noted is a system seeking stability, which is organic life on Earth. Organic life on Earth is basically this kind of similar thread. We're all related, right? The birds that we see around us, the plants that we see around us, they are all part of the kind of same system called life. And that system has sought stability by developing into an adaptive process by which it can change itself in response to whatever the conditions demand. Survival of the fittest is a way in which, no matter what, life itself can continue. Maybe not the species that you're a part of, but life itself will. So basically, we're viewing life itself as a big system seeking stability. And of course, anything can be viewed as a system, and anything viewed as a system should be viewed as something seeking stability. For another example, you right now, sitting here, are a system seeking stability in a variety of ways, right? But more generally, and I think that this is where Marx and Engels start to draw from Darwin, they recognized that human society is also a system seeking stability. But in order to really get into that, I think we need to approach a distinction. We need to kind of talk about trying to distinguish humans from other animals. So let's get into that. My ideas here kind of come from a guy named Paul Cockshott, just to let you know. My ideas here, which I don't really cite him for, they come from a book called How the World Works, which I think is a pretty adequate introduction to historical materialism, and I really like this point. So anyway, this is towards the idea of what do we mean by an economy. So I want to ask the question, what makes humans, we're part of this system called life, right? But we are ourselves another system. And so let's try to distinguish what makes humans different from other animals. Well, let's ask the question in terms of stability. What are the fundamental ways in which humans pursue stability which differ from other species? And there's two key ones to note, and I think he's right about this. Firstly, human labor is social. That is to say, we labor collectively to create the social product. I do this, you do that. Everybody does a different thing. Nobody does like everything that needs to be done for themselves to survive another day on their own. But nonetheless, if I do this and you do that, and we split up the labor, then at the end of the day, the idea is that everybody has gotten what they need, so that the society itself, the herd, the pack, etc., can survive another day. So humans are a socially laboring species, and that is one key distinction between humans and other animals. All animals have to work to survive. They have to extract energy from their environment and use it to reproduce. But one of the key distinctions is that humans do this socially, whereas most mammals don't. Although to varying degrees they do, right? You've got Kropotkin's notion of mutual aid, I think, is helpful here. But anyway, that's one way we do it. And already this is a very different framing from typical economics, even though we're not even at economics yet, because the economist likes to view things in terms of individuals each seeking their own stability. We're not doing that. We're looking at human society as a whole, seeking a collective stability. And I think that that's correct. We are not all tigers and lions. We didn't emerge from the rainforest that way. We emerged from the rainforest as cooperative packs that survived as a unit. Nobody ever lived in Minecraft world, essentially, right? Nobody's like a single person that's just surviving on their own. That's not how humans have evolved. That's not how humans have emerged into reality. We are a socially laboring species. So that alone doesn't make us unique, though, right? There's another species that is a great example, I think, that is also a socially laboring species, but is very different than us, and that's termites. Termites are also a socially laboring species. You have worker termites, you have breeder termites, you have warrior termites. So each termite does something different, and as a whole, like the termite mounds survive. And it's a funny thing to note that he notes in the book, which is that you know, in terms of biomass, they're actually the dominant species. And you can see a terrifyingly big termite mound right here in the picture. But you know, obviously, we haven't fully kind of distilled out what makes humans different than other animals if humans and termites are both socially laboring species. So the next question we need to ask is, what makes humans different from termites? And I think that the answer is that termites are born into their roles. If you are a worker termite, you were born biologically with a certain set of capabilities that make you a worker termite. Not all termites are born with the same capabilities. Some termites are born into their roles, whereas humans, with very few exceptions, right? Like, you know, reproductive labor is the only real exception. Humans are born more or less homogeneously. Any human is at least supposed to be able to do the same things as any other human. And the reason for that is that, you know, as a result of that, we divide up our labor, but we do it in a kind of more fluid way. We train each other into whatever roles are required by society, or required by whatever the conditions are of our existence. We train each other, and we kind of assume roles as they're necessary because everybody has the same capabilities. That's the real big difference. And I think it's an interesting question, and this is, I think, my own thoughts here, is to think of why a species would evolve like this. Why would a species evolve into a socially laboring species that is homogeneous, that trains each other into whatever roles are necessary? And I think the only answer to that is that we needed a mode of social organization that was able to adapt and change to external conditions, which themselves were changing faster than evolution could account for, right? I don't see any other way. I think that the only reason that a species like us would ever come into being is if it was required that you have a system which could seek, you had a socially laboring species that needed to continue to exist, because that's the goal, but that also needed to be able to change their society faster than they could evolve. And so, in other words, I think that we evolved out of a very tumultuous environment, climate change. I think that that's kind of a really important, I think that's why we evolved into the species we evolved into. But in any case, that's the big distinction, is our homogeneity and our ability to kind of assume roles as are necessary. And so our social organization, the social organization itself, is going to change. And so how is it going to change? And so this brings us to, with this kind of a laboring species, with a socially organized species that has to adapt and change its own mode of organization, a new type of labor emerges that other animals don't have to participate in. And that other type of labor is intellectual labor. Intellectual labor becomes a thing that humans simply have to do, because if you're going to have your society change and adapt in response to changing conditions, then you need people to be doing that. Then the form of labor that is the ability to reflect on, humans need to be able to reflect on their environment and make changes based on their perception of it. Termites don't have to think or reflect on their society. Biology does that for them. Humans, on the other hand, do, and that's the point. So a new kind of labor exists that for humans and not for termites, and that's intellectual labor. We all and we all participate in this process. Some people participate more than others, but it's important to note that it's not that when I talk about intellectual labor, I'm not just speaking about people like myself in academia doing thinking for a living. Everybody participates. And the proof of that is language. We invented this thing called language to communicate and facilitate a societal dialogue, and we taught it to everybody. Everybody was supposed to be able to think and see themselves as members of a society, so that they could form a critique of that society and come up with ideas about how to change it as is necessary. So we gave each other a vocabulary to kind of create some autonomy, so that we could kind of do this better. Words like me and I, right? So that we can conceive of ourselves within society and contemplate it. So the ideology is a part of this process of intellectual laboring. And art is another example of this. We make art. We do reflection in various ways. The social dialogue is just kind of a way to facilitate an adaptive system of changing social organization, and so. The conscious understanding of our society allows us to change it. It facilitates a process of social evolution, which can occur on a much larger timescale than its biological analog. And so I think this is where that kind of the very kind of crude, to some extent, base superstructure dynamic emerges, right? The base is what we're talking about. This is the social organization. This is how humans seek stability, right? But kind of collectively, we come up with a kind of ideology, and we come up with systems and customs and art, and we come up with various kind of a whole superstructure of culture and ideology on top that we use to change the base. That's the idea. Now obviously revolution is not present here right now. And, that's kind of Marx's whole deal, is revolution, right? Well, keep that in mind. We'll get there. Right now, this seems like a very slippery and seamless process. It seems like there shouldn't be any conflict. We just kind of change the base as is necessary. No conflict between each other is necessary right now. And the reason for that, I'll just spoil it, is that property has not emerged yet. But let's keep going. So we're now kind of actually in a position to define what we mean by economics. Economics, first and foremost, it's a type of intellectual labor. And specifically, it's the type of intellectual labor is to study the mode of organization that we tend to be engaged in, right? We organize ourselves into a kind of system of production where we kind of work together in specific ways, and nobody is fully conscious of what's going on, but by the end of the day, everybody has the stuff that they need to survive and reproduce. So that process, that organizational setting, to reflect on that is to study economics. So we've said a bunch of times already that the human species is a system seeking stability. We've also noted at this point that in order to do that, it organizes itself into a system of organization. But that system of organization is itself a system. And since it's a system, guess what it does? It seeks stability. And so what Marx and Engels noted is that there are these modes of organization. It's not that humans are in this kind of fluid mode of organization that's kind of changing all over the place. We have these modes of organization that are kind of stable, that don't really change very much, that kind of reproduce themselves. Humans reproduce ourselves, we reproduce the species, but the mode of production in the service of that process also is a system seeking stability and its own reproduction. And so this is a very important definition for like a Marxist. A mode of production is a semi-stable organization of human society which can reproduce itself and also reproduce the species. And so it's a mode of organization that allows the species to reproduce itself first and foremost, but it also needs to reproduce itself. And so we should say what we mean by that exactly. What does it mean to reproduce? What does it mean for a method of organization, a mode of organization, to reproduce itself? Well, it means two things. One, we have to consider the forces of production that humans are using, the tools and the factories and the raw materials and so forth, right? Humans, in order to, during the process of production throughout the day, they're going to consume raw materials. And so a mode of production that is an actual stable mode of production had better have a method of reproducing those raw materials so that they can be consumed again the next day, right? The setup has to be, we have to remake the initial condition. You got factories. Does your mode of production have factories? Well, you better have your mode of production better be able to naturally do the necessary upkeep to those factories. You got to make sure that your tools are being kept, and so forth. The forces of production have to be maintained each day. So that's one thing that a stable mode of organization has to be able to do. And then the other thing it has to do is it has to be able to reproduce the actual human relations of production. So, I wake up in the morning and I know what I am. I go and do this. And so, but more broadly, we have some kind of very specific roles. So, a good example is capitalism. In capitalism, you've got kind of two major roles. There's more than two, but the two big roles are the capitalist and the worker. And the worker here is really interesting because we're going to talk more about this later, but the working class, and I'm not really talking about class yet. I'm talking about just the role more so. But the social role of the worker, or the social role of the worker, is to be somebody that has been completely dispossessed of any means of helping themselves. The worker doesn't have the means of production. We'll define that later. They don't have what they need to produce the food that they need or the shelter that they need to survive. They don't have anything that they need to survive, and so they're forced. They're kind of left with no choice but to go into the market, this thing called the market, and to sell their labor to a capitalist to get money so that they can use that money to get the stuff that they need to survive the next day. And so one of the more sinister aspects of capitalism, but also as an example of the reproduction of the relations of production, is that capitalism, in order to continue to exist and be stable, has to continually reproduce a dispossessed class of people with no choice but to go out and sell their labor. And capitalism is very good at this. But that's what we mean. When we talk about a mode of production reproducing itself, it also has to reproduce these relations, however unequal they might be. So we're now at the point where we can start to really kind of tell the story of historical materialism. And the story of historical materialism really doesn't begin, in some sense, until agricultural society begins. And so let's set the stage for that. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were hunter-gatherer species, right? We moved around, we were more or less nomadic, and we hunted game to survive. Now, there's a lot of theories about why humans transitioned to agriculture, a lot of really interesting theories that I think, a lot of good Marxist theories, but I'm not going to get into those. We're going to skip to the point where humans are stationary and farming. And from there, we're going to tell a story about how this thing called class comes into being. So since the dawn of agriculture, these larger groups than before began accumulating a surplus. That's the big thing. With agriculture comes a surplus product. We end up with more grain and things than we had the day before. We start to produce extra. And so each cycle of production left society with more than it had before: grain, domesticated animals, pottery, jewelry, luxury produce, etc. And of course, this is a messy system. We're humans and we have this adaptive system. When you have an adaptive organizational system, it's not going to be perfect. And so the surplus was never distributed equitably from the beginning. From the moment that this surplus started to exist, it was never distributed equally. And that's due to the asymmetric nature of the social division of labor. And it's due to the kind of power dynamics implicit to that, which kind of exist in a kind of incubatory state. Some groups, probably without even realizing it, had more political power than others, and this translated to disparity in the distribution of the surplus. And I should probably stop here and make sure to clarify that this is my own sort of version of the story. There's no way to kind of give a unified version of this, but this is just my version. So here, the way I would describe the story is the way I'm describing it. So modes of production are not static, like we said, nor are they meant to be. They are kind of broadly stable, but they're not completely stable. Their stability serves our own. And that means that they have to adapt to changing conditions. And so they have their own internal dynamics from which they develop over time. So the modes of production are static, but they're also changing in kind of a more micro sense. In the macro, they're static, but in the micro, they're constantly adapting and tweaking and changing. In particular, the forces of production that we mentioned in the last slide have a tendency to develop and advance. The machines that we make, the technology that humans use, sorry, I heard something. The technology that humans use has a tendency to advance. Let's just say on its own. Again, I'm just telling kind of a quick version of the story here. Humans tend to become better at what they do. They tend to invent newer and more efficient ways to labor and reproduce themselves. And this consequently changing nature of the mode of production tends to, exacerbate inequality. Unequal distribution of the surplus gives way to making life intolerable for groups of people whose social role places them farther down the ladder, as that surplus itself is fed back into production and converted into necessity. So what I'm trying to say here is that in my version of the story, which could be somewhat wrong, and it could have issues, it probably does, but in my version of the story, these forces of production that were never, the surplus, which was never distributed equitably, in response to the forces of production developing, that surplus that used to be surplus has a tendency to become necessary over time, as society begins to consume more because its forces of production increase. And so because of that, that kind of more innocent, I had a cake, I gave some of it to this guy, but most of it to this guy, the other guy might be a little annoyed, but at least his life isn't threatened. But over time, that inequality in the distribution of surplus is going to become less and less tolerable as the standards of society change. And so that is going to create conflict very quickly. First, and another factor further exacerbating this, I've been talking about internal changes, right? The mode of production tends to change and produce this, but that's probably minor compared to what really causes this, which is external shocks to the system, right? Encroachment or competition from rival societies, and most importantly, a changing climate. We could talk about, every major change to the mode of production arguably has a climate event that is outside of the system itself that happened, right? And so, in my opinion, the social division of labor on its own does not initially produce class. But, however, through a combination of internal contradictions within the system and external shocks to it, the division of labor gives way to permanent disparities in both real wealth and political power, the latter of which is, of course, going to mirror the former. Because how would they have become the ones with the wealth if they didn't have the political power to begin with? And so, in my opinion, classes emerge, what we call classes, emerge precisely when the preservation of the mode of production requires an emergent ruling class to employ force to violently subdue the other classes in order to keep things the same, in order to keep them in the more desirable role and them in the less desirable role. So what I'm trying to say is that the forces of production develop, external shocks hit the system, the growing surplus becomes necessary, and life becomes intolerable for the have-nots in that relationship. And eventually things become so intolerable that the only way to continue that division of labor as it exists is to force it. In order for, in other words, create a monopoly on violence and subdue the people that don't want to be in their role anymore. That, and that right there is the moment when classes become a thing. And also, this is also the moment when the state becomes a thing, right? The state is now a thing. You have this kind of, a monopoly on violence that is being used to subdue the population and force things to stay the same, right? This is the birth of the state in addition to the birth of class. They happen simultaneously, which is one of the main points that Engels is trying to make in his book, Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. I mean, you can criticize it anthropologically, but I think it still makes really good points regarding all this stuff, and I do recommend people read it. But his main point is that those three things cannot be thought of individually. They are all a simultaneous process. But in any case, we're now at the point where we can talk about class. And one thing that we can note immediately about class is that it has nothing to do with simple income brackets. We have not even talked about money yet, and we're not assuming that money exists in our mode of production. It probably doesn't. It has the class. I want to repeat that. Class has nothing to do with income brackets. Income brackets are like a correlative symptom of class, right? It just so happens that the lower classes have a low income, exist in a low income bracket. But you are not defined to be working class because you're a low income bracket. That is a symptom. It's not the real thing. And so let's talk about what class is. So a Marxist, to say it in the Marxist sense, class has a dual character. It has a subjective character and an objective character. And I think a lot of Marxists tend to overly focus on one or the other. But neither is sufficient, in my opinion, on its own. You need both. So let's start with the objective character of class. The objective character of class is the material part. We kind of said it already, right? We mentioned it in the context of a worker. A worker in capitalism is a worker because they are dispossessed and they have no means of securing what they need to survive aside from selling their labor to a capitalist. To the extent that that is your life, that is the extent to which you are a worker in the objective sense. So pretty simple. Although, it's not what people think it is. A lot of people think it's income brackets, but as you can see, it has nothing to do with income brackets and everything to do with social roles. And just kind of I have a nice quote along these lines from a journal called Chuang, which is a really great communist journal on China. If you're interested in what modern China is, I would seriously recommend this. Here's a cool quote about that. Class is not a simple designator for those who have authority and those who don't, nor is it a sociological tool for cutting a population into brackets of income or education. Class is an immanent polarity generated by the social character of production. It's an emergent property of the way that things are made and basic human needs are met within a given mode of production. Constantly maintained and continually reproduced by this process, the power of a ruling class is largely power over the means of production and the force guaranteeing that production continue. But it's rarely a power over the nature of the mode of production itself. So they're making a separate point at the end that we haven't really gotten to yet. They're mentioning how the capitalist class, the ruling class, doesn't necessarily have a commanding power over the mode of production any more than the worker does. And we'll see that very, very clearly when we get into Marx's kind of actual presentation of the economic dynamics of capitalism. We'll see that very clearly. But in any case, I think this is a great great quote about what class is and what it isn't in the objective sense. But in the subjective sense, class has everything to do with your experience of class. Your subjective experience of class is another thing that defines class every bit as much as the objective material conditions of your life. You're a worker if you experience being a worker. Now, obviously, that is not a sufficient way to define it. So so the way to understand this is through this idea of class consciousness, which I think is something that a lot of Marxists even kind of don't understand as well as they should. So what is class consciousness? Well, I have kind of a story I like to tell to kind of make it very clear what we're talking about, or at least what I think we're talking about. And so it's a scenario that I'm gonna kind of explain in the second person to you. And if you haven't experienced this, I think you'll still understand what my point of it is. So let's suppose that you spend a few years of your life in an abusive, manipulative relationship with somebody. Now, as is often the case, you know, if you're in a relationship like this, it's kind of hard to tell what's actually going on. You can't. It's too close to you. You can't really figure out what's actually kind of going on in your life. And this is kind of a problem with single kind of, you know, monogamous relationships to some extent is your isolation within them and your inability to process what's going on as a result of that isolation. But that's a whole nother story. But yeah, let's say that that's you, and then you get out of that relationship, like, you know. So that's you, and then you get out of that relationship, and then a few years, and so you carry those experiences with you for a few years, and then you run into somebody that, you know, let's say at a coffee shop or something, that happened to have been in the same relationship with who happened to have been in a relationship with that same person for an extended amount of time, and also just got out of that relationship. And so, of course, you're going to sit down with this person and talk to them for a bit. And so you sit down and talk to them for a bit, and for a good while, and you kind of share your experiences with one another. And here's what happens. The two of you both walk away from that interaction smarter, literally smarter than you were before. The two of you kind of, I'm trying to try not to get too metaphysical about this, but you know, by sharing by kind of, putting together your heads and putting together those shared experiences, the two of you were both able to obtain a much better understanding of what that actual experience was than you had before. A much better idea of it than you could on your own. It wasn't just that you problem solved together. It wasn't just that you got more information. Something very kind of spiritual almost kind of happens when you do this. You walk away from that interaction just with an amplified understanding of what happened. And in particular, you walk away with an amplified understanding of your exploitation and the way that you were manipulative. You can understand it better. You can see it more clearly. And maybe that means you can do something about it. That's class consciousness. Of course, you know, that's not class consciousness. That's some other kind of consciousness. But that is what class consciousness is about. When we're talking about solidarity, when we're talking about class consciousness, you experienced solidarity to that other person that was in the same abusive relationship with you. This idea of kind of amplifying your understanding of a situation by living an experience with somebody else that's experiencing the same things as you, and the social forces that arise from that's class consciousness. So to give another example, you know, the Putilov Ironworks were, like, I think the biggest steel making factory in Russia, you know, in like from 1905 to like 1917. It was this almost city-sized like factory that employed like 17,000 people, and the people that worked there lived there. They slept there. They ate there. They slept there in like barracks with tons of other workers that were experiencing the exact same things as them. You know, experiencing the same abuse and exploitation from bosses as them. You're going around and you're seeing thousands of other people that are just like you, experiencing the same misfortunes as you, and with nobody to stick up for them other than you and everyone like you. You see where I'm going with this? Those workers were able to, because of their proximity to each other and their shared experiences, able to understand their situation better than they could have individually. And that is what we mean when we talk about the subjective character of being a worker, the subjective character of class in general. It's the same thing for the capitalist class. The capitalist class, honestly, probably is more class conscious than the working class right now, because if you're a billionaire and you have a kid, that kid is going to experience nothing but life with other billionaires. They're certainly not going to interact with those dregs of society, right? Those lower, God forbid, heavens forbid, you end up having to talk to one of these, service workers or something. Jeez, you go to a private school, you go to fancy dinner parties, and you only interact with people of your class, and you're going to leave with kind of an ideological conception of your reality that is determined by your class. And so this is actually, I'm going to try not to get too far into this right now, but we already talked about, society is a system. The human species as a system is a system before the human individual, kind of. In any case, this vocabulary we came up with, I and me, ways to refer to yourself within it and ways to behave autonomously within it, you could argue that is just kind of humans being humans, but I probably would argue against that. I would probably say that, look, systems tend to work the best when you let the individual kind of atomic units of whatever that system is behave autonomously. The more autonomously the kind of individual moving parts of your system can act, the better off your system is going to be. And that's exactly what we have done by giving each other a vocabulary to refer to ourselves and to see ourselves as autonomous individuals within a social organism. And so that social organism has in some sense been corrupted by class, in the sense that it's been discretized by class. The working class consciousness and the capitalist class consciousness in capitalism, and of course there's other modes of production like feudalism and stuff, but but those two consciousnesses have kind of emerged separately from each other. They've split. You've got one group that sees the world a certain way, and you've got another group that sees the world a certain way. And it's not, even that's not so clear anymore, because the ruling class can impose its ideology on the lower class. But in any case, you have these kinds of like consciousnesses that are social in nature. I'll concede that individual consciousness exists. Well, you've still got these social consciousnesses. You've still got this kind of aggregate worker, this like social, this kind of aggregate consciousness that is the working class ideology for the world. And I see that as kind of a single actor, right? And so the subjective character of class is your connection to that aggregate consciousness. Which one do you align with? You kind of have to pick one, and that's your class. That's the subjective character of class. How do you identify? Do you identify as a worker? And all of what, class consciousness is what that entails. Solidarity is what that entails. Everything we just talked about. So yeah, that's class consciousness. That's what class means. So we're finally at the point where we can sort of put it all together. We're at the point where we kind of have almost the loop made that is historical materialism, that is history, that we call history. And so this, I'm just going to read some of this. So from here, societal development itself takes on a somewhat stable outer form. Classes come into conflict with one another. The lower classes wish to change the relations of production. They've got their own consciousness, right? They're forming their own critique of society. They want it to change. The ruling classes wants to preserve it, though. And this is really the big difference between class society that emerged when we started doing agriculture 5,000 years ago and human society before that. The biggest difference is just that you've got this inertial element. You've got this kind of corrupted, discrete consciousness that is the ruling class's consciousness, which is a resistance to any kind of change to the base at all. The ruling classes, you didn't have this before. You have a kind of a conservatism probably always existed, but you didn't have this kind of a drive to keep things the same at your own peril. But now you do. You've got a lower class that is progressive by kind of nature, and a ruling class that is conservative, if not reactionary, by nature. And these groups battle over control of the state. I could get into the concept of like fetishism here, and the way that we objectify things away from ourselves, the way that we alienate agency away to the state to make it seem more objective in almost a form of worship. But like the state itself becomes a battleground. The state, the state is created by the ruling class to repress and subjugate the lower class, but eventually it becomes something of a at least outwardly neutral thing to fight over. Control of the state. Who has the power to control it? These groups battle for control of the state, both its repressive and its ideological departments. Class society serves to discretize the until then fluid computation of societal development. What I mean by that is that you've got this kind of loop happening. In pre-agricultural society, the base, shapes and maintains the superstructure as the thing shows. This is kind of the ideological kind of collective consciousness of society, and then it moves back and it influences the base, and then it reacts to that. And this is very much computation. And you can go through my videos if you want to see how this literally can be seen as computation. The video is called History as Computation. But I do see this as computation. And until class society emerges, it's kind of a fluid computation. But now it's a discrete computation, almost like a normal computer computation, right? What I mean by that is that the section of society becomes resistant to any change. A dam sort of builds up here. A lot of energy gets stored here. It's almost like a capacitor. A lot of energy gets stored here. It really wants to influence the base. It really wants to change what's down here, but it can't do it. It can't quite get down. There's a dam formation here, and a kind of inertia, an inertial resistance by the ruling class. But eventually, hopefully, it has to break. And this is revolution. That is when you get a step of the computation. The forces of production continue to develop. That's important to note again. But the relations of production, that is the class dynamics, stubbornly refuse to conform to that new reality. So that's another thing I forgot to mention, is that the forces of production never stops developing. That's a thing that just keeps happening. It happens at different paces depending on the mode of production, but the forces of production develop. They like to do that. And that those changing forces of production necessitate a changing relation of production, not just to redistribute wealth, but to actually just kind of reacclimate and optimize around those new forces of production, right? If my central energy production source is windmills, then I have to scatter windmills at kind of far distances from each other all over the landscape, and that is conducive to a certain kind of social arrangement where you have small villages and peasants and stuff like that. But if my central kind of unit of production is a factory, then society is going to have to change a lot, right? Urban centers are going to become much more important in a society where those are the forces of production. So the forces of production change, and that itself necessitates a change in relations of production, just to optimize the production itself, just to optimize the process. And so you've got people whose conditions are becoming more and more intolerable. You've got relations of production that are increasingly antiquated compared to the forces of production, and eventually something has got to change. The ruling class can resist as much as they want, but eventually this dam, okay, it doesn't have to, but hopefully eventually this dam breaks and explodes. And at that point you have a gigantic explosion of social change all happening at once, and you get a full step of this computation. The old stuff is swept away and a whole new system is implemented. The relations of production, hopefully, what did I write here? The dam no longer holds, it bursts. The old relations are swept aside, surplus is redistributed, and new relations are established which are more aligned with the forces of production, hopefully. That's the ideal sense in which you get a Marxist revolution. This is what revolution factors into historical materialism. And it's also in this way that class struggle becomes the motor of history, and revolution becomes its locomotive. I don't think that people take that first line of the Communist Manifesto seriously enough when they say the history of society is a history of class struggle. Obviously it is, from this kind of conception of history as I've described it. But I mean, you could ask the question, and I haven't really seen anyone talk about this, but you could ask the question, what is Marx saying there? Is he saying that history is all about class struggle, or is he actually defining history? Is that a definition? Is he defining history as class struggle? Because I think that would be valid too. What we perceive as history is just a chronicling of this struggle over time. I mean, that's another way you can kind of see it. History is this loop where you get revolution or defer revolution, or there's a lot of let's not do revolution, let's go invade some other society over here. And then there's also this thing Marx mentions right in that first paragraph called common ruin. It is possible, unfortunately, that this process kind of gets stuck and nothing can change. And the dam just kind of keeps reinforcing itself. And this has happened before. It arguably happened with ancient Rome. And it's happened, I think, many times in China. And when that happens in the past, it's always been the case that a more dynamic society comes along and sort of displaces it and replaces it with its own social dynamic and kind of restarts the class struggle. Now we're in a sort of globalized society where you can't really have that happen. So let's not think about the scenario in which we are in the common ruin. Let's continue to think that this process can continue. You know, the human ability to adapt and change and alter their mode of production is a use it or lose it thing, in my opinion. If you encounter a situation of like global common ruin, where nothing can change, then it seems to me as if over a long period of time, assuming the species doesn't annihilate itself, which it probably would, but let's say it didn't, I think what eventually you get is an evolution in which the species diverges. You get the upper class evolving into something physically, biologically different than the lower class. And what do you get? Well, at that point, we're termites again, aren't we? You know, you kind of, like I said, this sort of loop of adjustment is a use it or lose it thing in that way. So let's use it. Anyway, that's historical materialism in a nutshell, in like, you know, a kind of long but still kind of abridged presentation of it. And I think that's a good place to stop the first part. In the next video, we'll actually be getting into the volumes of capital. In the volumes of capital, Marx is going to analyze the capitalist mode of production, and he's going to look at the way that it is likely to develop in any scenario. And so we're going to kind of focus in on capitalism in the next part.